welcome to Thelina. Today, we are setting an intention together for one of the turning points of your life. Perhaps a door gently opens, perhaps a seed silently begins to sprout. Today, we whisper to those seeds our intention to step outside narcissistic and manipulative games. Before we begin the video, if the Series 1 Create resonates with you and supports you, with your support we can reach more hearts. Subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts mean a great deal to me. Thank you in advance. Now, let us begin our new journey. From the nobility of the soul to the subtlety of everyday life. Being respectable is often misunderstood. Some people confuse it with power, others with status, and some with how they are perceived in the eyes of others. Yet true respectability is a quiet depth. It does not announce itself, it is felt. It is understood not through display, but through presence. In today's series, we explore together what it truly means to be a respectable person. This is not a list of rules. Rather, it is an inner journey that reminds us of the posture of the soul. Because respect begins with the relationship a person builds with themselves, and then it radiates outward into the world. As you listen to or read this text, it is enough to ask yourself one simple question. What kind of trace am I leaving behind? 1. Respect begins with the relationship you build with yourself. A respectable person does not center how they appear to others. They first observe how they speak to themselves. Because however a person positions themselves in their inner world, they will land in the same place in the outer world. Someone who constantly diminishes themselves should not be surprised when others belittle them. Someone who treats themselves harshly, mercilessly, and impatiently unconsciously creates space for others to use the same language toward them. In daily life, this becomes very clear. For example, someone who erases their boundaries by constantly saying, "It's not important." Someone who never says they are tired and then feels quietly hurt inside. Someone who says, "Okay," to things they do not want and then creates distance afterward. None of these are goodwill. These are the places where self-respect is lacking. From a psychological perspective, people test the boundaries of the person in front of them. This is not malice, it is an unconscious reflex of human nature. If you do not claim your own boundaries, others will not do it for you. On the contrary, they assume those boundaries do not exist. A respectable person does not become harsh here, but they become clear. They say, "I can't," to what they cannot do. They do not create justifications for what they do not want. They do not engage in long explanations to defend themselves. This attitude surprises the other person. Because manipulation often works on people who over-explain and lack self-confidence. From a spiritual perspective, this situation tells us one thing. The soul does not grow by diminishing itself. On the contrary, it matures by recognizing its own space. Respecting yourself is not arrogance. It is being able to say, "I am here, and I know my place." Psychological awareness. Today, when someone asks something of you, do not respond immediately. Ask yourself inwardly, do I truly want this, or am I afraid of not being loved if I say no? Even noticing this question is enough to disrupt the games. Intentions. I set the intention to soften the way I speak to myself. I set the intention to express my boundaries without guilt. I set the intention to release the habit of seeking acceptance by diminishing myself. I set the intention not to postpone the needs of my soul. I set the intention to have the courage to stand where I am. Affirmations. When I respect myself, the world reflects it back to me. My boundaries do not separate me, they protect me. Saying no does not close my heart. I am more at peace when I am aligned with myself. I am enough exactly as I am. 2. A respectable person does not feel obliged to enter the narcissistic game. Narcissistic personalities position the existence of others in a way that serves their own center. When you are in a relationship with them, you may unconsciously begin to experience this. Explaining yourself, proving yourself, correcting yourself, justifying yourself. This is exactly where the game begins. A narcissist does not crush you directly. First, they place you in front of a mirror. You're too sensitive. You're making an issue out of this too. Everyone thinks this way. But there is no everyone. There is only a mind trying to shake your perception. A respectable person recognizes the game here. The other person never takes responsibility, yet constantly pushes you into questioning yourself. At this point, what needs to be done is not to argue. A narcissist does not argue, they play mental chess. And the way to win that game is to refuse to play it. A respectable person does not make long explanations, does not fall into the reflex of self-defense, and considers the sentence, "This is how I feel," to be enough. Because they know that explaining yourself to someone who does not want to understand serves no purpose other than exhausting your soul. From a spiritual perspective, this is about calling your energy back. The soul does not come into this world to prove itself. Disrupting the narcissistic game. If someone constantly forces you to explain yourself, stay with this sentence. I don't want to look for a reason to feel this way. This sentence stops the narcissistic game. Because the fuel of the game is your explanations. Intentions. I set the intention to free myself from the need to prove myself. I set the intention not to shape myself according to someone else's perception. I set the intention to call my energy back. I set the intention not to exhaust myself in order to be understood. I set the intention to take my own truth seriously. Affirmations. I do not have to explain myself. What I feel is valid. My silence is not weakness, it is clarity. I am safe when I do not enter games. My energy belongs to me. 3. Respect toward guilt-inducing people begins with distinguishing the emotion. People who induce guilt do not shout. They make things heavier, quietly. I did all this for you. I never thought you would leave me like this. So you give up this easily. What these sentences have in common is this. The other person places the responsibility for their own feelings onto you. A respectable person does not close their heart here, but they also do not carry the burden, because they have learned to distinguish this. Empathy is one thing, carrying guilt is another. Someone being upset does not mean you did something wrong. Someone's disappointment does not mean you should not set boundaries. Psychologically, people like this build connection by triggering the other person's conscience. This may not be a conscious cruelty, but the result is the same, you become heavier. A respectable person does this here. They do not become defensive. They do not try to clear their name. They do not feel obliged to say, "You're right." They simply return the emotion to its owner. Disrupting the guilt game. Use this sentence. It's understandable that you feel this way, but it doesn't mean I did something wrong. This sentence preserves empathy, but does not take on the burden. Intentions. I set the intention not to carry another person's emotions. I set the intention not to open my conscience to manipulation. I set the intention not to blame myself when I set boundaries. I set the intention to distinguish empathy from self-sacrifice. I set the intention to become lighter. Affirmations. Not every emotion has to belong to me. My boundaries do not close my heart. Staying true to myself is not selfish. Guilt is not proof of love. I am releasing the burdens I carry. 4. Manipulation creates urgency. A respectable person slows down. Manipulative people create speed, urgency, pressure, uncertainty. You have to decide now. You're overreacting. You'll regret this later. But the truth is this: healthy relationships do not rush. The greatest antidote to manipulation is slowing down. A respectable person knows this. That is why they do not respond immediately, do not make decisions while under emotional pressure, do not perceive silence as a threat. From a spiritual perspective, this is a return to the inner compass. The soul does not rush. The mind does. Disrupting manipulation. Stay with this sentence: I need time to think about this. That's all. No explanation. No justification. The manipulative mind stops here. Because the speed has been cut. Intentions. I set the intention not to make rushed decisions. I set the intention to reclaim my time. I set the intention to recognize pressure. I set the intention to create space for my inner voice. I set the intention to protect my slowness. Affirmations. I am not in a hurry. I have time to think. Silence is my space. I make my own decisions. The more I slow down, the clearer I become. 5. Clarity toward passive-aggressive behavior is the calmest form of respect. Passive-aggressive behaviors do not make noise. They do not shout, openly attack, or clearly say, I have a problem. Instead, they imply, withdraw, fall silent, and leave the other person in uncertainty. This uncertainty is not accidental. The passive-aggressive person, rather than expressing their feelings directly, expects the other person to sense them. As a result, two things happen. First, they avoid taking responsibility. Second, they keep the other person constantly on edge. In daily life, we recognize this behavior in very familiar phrases. There's no problem, but the body language says otherwise. I'm fine, yet they create distance. Never mind, but later, they punish. A respectable person knows an important distinction here. Silence is not always calm. Sometimes, silence is the quietest weapon of suppressed anger. Psychologically, passive-aggressive behavior emerges at the intersection of conflict avoidance and the need for control. The person is afraid to speak openly but wants their feelings to be noticed. That is why they choose indirect paths such as implication, coldness, and withdrawal. A respectable person does not fall into this game in the following ways. They do not chase implications. They do not try to decode silence. They do not position themselves as the one who asks, "What did I do?" Because they know this: a feeling that is not clearly expressed is not a puzzle I am responsible for solving. The biggest mistake here is mistaking passive-aggressive behavior for thoughtfulness or sensitivity. In reality, this pattern poisons relationships in the long run. It does not nourish open communication, but rather an emotional guessing game. The stance of a respectable person here is not harsh, but clear. They name the emotion. They make the uncertainty visible. For example, I sense that you are angry with me, but I need to hear it clearly. You say there is no problem, but your behavior tells a different story. These sentences are not accusatory, but they lift the fog. Passive-aggressive behaviors lose their power once they become visible, because the ground they stand on is uncertainty. When clarity arrives, the game is disrupted. From a spiritual perspective, this tells us something important. The soul does not speak in indirect ways. The soul loves clarity. Implication is not the language of the soul, but of fear. A respectable person does not try to manage another person's fear, but they also do not leave their own space to uncertainty, disrupting the passive-aggressive game. If someone says, "There's no problem," but punishes you through their behavior, stay with this sentence. If there is something, I'm ready to talk about it openly. If not, I won't take this distance personally. This sentence does not deny the emotion, but does not take ownership of the uncertainty. The other person either speaks or remains alone with their silence. Intentions. I set the intention not to get lost in implications. I set the intention to meet uncertainty with clarity. I set the intention not to take silent punishments personally. I set the intention to ask for open communication. I set the intention to protect my space from foggy emotions. Affirmations. Clarity is my nature. I do not have to carry emotions that are not spoken openly. Silence is not always my responsibility. I choose reality over implication. My calmness is an expression of my respect. 6. A respectable person does not place themselves in the rescuer role. At first glance, the rescuer role appears virtuous. It is described as sacrifice, compassion, being a good person. But more often than not, a hidden imbalance lies beneath this role. The one who rescues unconsciously places themselves above. The one being helped remains below. In the long run, this imbalance nourishes neither love nor respect. In daily life, this role is very familiar. They can't manage without me. If I'm not there, they'll fall apart. If I don't pull things together, everything will go wrong. These sentences look like love, but they carry a burden within them. And every burden eventually demands something in return. Psychologically, the rescuer role is often fed from two sources. First, the need to feel valuable. Second, the fear of abandonment. A person believes that being needed will make them permanent. But this is an illusion. Because being needed and being respected are not the same thing in a relationship. A respectable person recognizes this role from here. The more they help, the more exhausted they feel. The more support they give, the more invisible they become. And eventually, the sentence, "I did all this for you," begins to rise inside them. That is where a boundary has been crossed. The rescuer role takes responsibility away from the other person. And a person whose responsibility is taken away does not grow. That is why this role, contrary to belief, is not healing but dependency creating. Manipulative people use this role very well. They display their weak sides, polish their victimhood, and skillfully place, "if it weren't for you," sentences. But pay attention. Someone who truly needs help does not drain you. A respectable person does not close their heart here. But they clearly distinguish this. Helping is one thing. Carrying another person's life is another. Therefore, they do not solve every problem. Do not regulate every emotion. Do not take on every crisis. And most importantly, they do not blame themselves for not rescuing. From a spiritual perspective, this tells us something important. Every soul is here to live its own lessons. If you constantly clear someone else's path, that path closes itself to learning. A respectable person does not get lost in another's darkness. They light the way, but leave the walking to them. Releasing the rescuer role. When someone constantly expects you to fix things, stay with this sentence. There is a part of this that you need to resolve yourself. This sentence is not indifferent, but it returns responsibility. The rescuer role falls away here. The relationship either becomes equal, or reveals its true face. Intentions. I set the intention not to automatically take on other people's burdens. I set the intention to distinguish helping from self-sacrifice. I set the intention to remember that I do not have to be necessary to be valuable. I set the intention to respect everyone's own path. I set the intention to become lighter. Affirmations. I do not have to fix everything. Taking responsibility is not the same as carrying a burden. Other people's lives do not belong to me. When I stay true to myself, I am in respect. When I help, I do not lose myself. 7. A respectable person does not prove themselves to those who constantly test their worth. Some people do not criticize you openly. They do not shout, attack, or directly belittle you. Instead, they constantly test you. These tests often appear innocent. I was just joking, you get offended so easily. Do you really think that? Not everyone is as sensitive as you. If you can even manage to do that, of course. The purpose of these sentences is not to gain information. The purpose is to remind you of your place. Psychologically, this behavior is fueled by the other person's need to establish superiority. To feel above, they try to pull you down. And they usually do this through small, subtle moves. Because open attacks provoke reaction, covert tests, however, slowly erode you from within. A respectable person recognizes this game from here. After every test, they find themselves explaining. They blame themselves for not laughing at the joke. They consider that they may have misunderstood a sentence. But the issue is not misunderstanding. The issue is the constant questioning of your position. People who test your worth want one thing: to place you in a defensive position. Because the one who defends is psychologically below. A respectable person is calm enough to disrupt the game here. They do not harden, nor do they attempt to prove themselves. Because they know this: the moment someone starts proving themselves, they have already entered the game. That is why they do not play along with humiliating jokes. Do not fall into the "you misunderstood" trap. Do not make approval-seeking explanations. Sometimes they simply look. Sometimes they change the subject. And sometimes they say just this much: I don't like being spoken to this way. This sentence is neither long nor aggressive. But it draws a clear boundary. From a spiritual perspective, this tells us something essential. Worth is not built through external approval. The soul does not have to prove itself. A respectable person knows this and does not move from their place. And no game can be played with someone who does not move. Disrupting the worth test. When someone makes a belittling joke about you, do not laugh immediately. Pause for a moment and say, "That joke didn't sit well with me." No defense. No explanation. Just reality. This stops the person who is testing. Because the test receives no response. Intentions. I set the intention not to measure my worth by others' reactions. I set the intention not to make space for humiliating jokes. I set the intention to notice the reflex to defend myself. I set the intention to remain in my place. I set the intention to protect my quiet strength. Affirmations. My worth is not up for debate. I do not have to prove myself. My clarity protects me. My silence is not weakness, it is a stance. I am solid where I stand. 8. A respectable person does not submit to silent punishment. Silent punishment does not shout. It does not slam doors. It does not say, "It's over." Instead, it withdraws. Messages are answered late. The voice softens. Presence diminishes. and the other person finds themselves inside a field of punishment without even understanding what happened. At first glance, this behavior may look like calmness. But in truth, it is a passive use of power. Because silent punishment aims for one thing: to make the other person fill the gap. What did I do? Did I say something wrong? Did something happen? If these questions begin, the game has begun. Psychologically, silent punishment is seen in people who avoid open conflict but have a high need for control. The person does not want to express their anger or hurt, because that might make them appear vulnerable. Instead, they withdraw and leave the other person in uncertainty. Uncertainty is a powerful weapon. Because the human mind does not like empty space. And as the space stretches on, a person begins to blame themselves. A respectable person has a very critical awareness here. Silence is not always maturity. Sometimes silence is the quietest way of avoiding responsibility. The most common mistake at this point is this: mistaking the other person's silence for respect. Let me not push. I'll give them time. Of course, everyone may need time. But if the silence feels like it carries a message, this is no longer rest, it is avoidance of communication. A respectable person does not do the following here. They do not try to solve the silence. They do not try to guess the other person's feelings. They do not suspend their own reality. Instead, they name the silence. This is a very powerful move. Because silent punishment loses its effect once it is named. For example, I feel that you've been creating distance lately. If there's something, I would prefer to talk about it openly. These sentences do not contain pressure, but they return responsibility. Silent punishment wants the other person to act out of guilt. A respectable person does not do this. They remain in their own center. From a spiritual perspective, this tells us something important. The soul wants to connect. Connection is built not through silence, but through truth. A respectable person does not diminish themselves to keep a bond from breaking. If there is a bond, it can be spoken. If it cannot be spoken, there is already an imbalance there. Disrupting silent punishment. When someone creates distance from you and you feel that this is an avoidance of communication, stay with this sentence. If you don't want to talk, I respect that. But I'm not taking this silence personally. This sentence does not apply pressure, but does not take on guilt. Silent punishment falls flat here, because the intended effect does not occur. Intentions. I set the intention not to try to resolve silent punishments. I set the intention to name uncertainty. I set the intention not to act out of guilt. I set the intention to remain in my own center. I set the intention to ask for open communication. Affirmations. Silence does not control me. I do not have to carry emotions that are not expressed openly. I am safe in my own reality. Guilt does not belong to me. I remain in clarity. 9. Not entering a power struggle is not weakness. Some people experience relationships not as spaces of sharing, but as hidden battlefields. Who is right? Who is stronger? Who had the last word? Who stepped back? Where these questions circulate, there is not connection, but competition. Power struggles are rarely declared openly. They advance quietly. Constant corrections, interruptions, belittling statements of superiority, comparisons that begin with, if it were me. In such relationships, a person unknowingly begins to live on alert. They weigh every sentence they speak. They think they have lost when they stay silent. They believe they have been crushed when they do not respond. This is the greatest trap of a power struggle. Presenting silence as defeat. Psychologically, Power struggles arise where a person does not trust their own inner strength. They try to exist by establishing superiority over others. That is why they constantly want to provoke reactions from the other person. Because the one who receives a reaction is the one who controls the game. A respectable person has a very clear awareness here. Not every call has to be answered. Not every challenge has to be accepted. Not entering a power struggle is not retreating. It is rejecting the rules of the game. A respectable person is not interested in winning arguments, does not feel the need to have the last word, does not try to prove their righteousness. Because they know this, being right and preserving one's dignity are not the same thing. Sometimes you win the argument but lose the relationship. And sometimes, by not entering the argument, you win yourself. Manipulative and narcissistic people love power struggles because they feed on them. Your anger, your defensiveness, your raised voice are fuel for them. A respectable person does not provide this fuel. They remain silent, but not passive. They become clear, but do not attack. They withdraw, but do not disappear. Sometimes they simply say, "This is not a competition." This sentence says a lot, because it renders the power struggle meaningless. From a spiritual perspective, this tells us something important. True power is not gained from the outside. It is anchored within. When the soul is self-assured, it does not need to prove anything. That is why a respectable person does not leave their place. But they also do not step onto the battlefield, disrupting the power struggle. When someone tries to pull you into an argument and you sense that it is a struggle for superiority, stay with this sentence. I don't want to talk about this in this way. No explanation, no defense, no counter move. The game collapses here, because a war requires two people. Intentions. I set the intention not to respond to every call. I set the intention to notice the need to be right. I set the intention to protect my power through silence. I set the intention to withdraw from competition. I set the intention to remain in my inner balance. Affirmations. My power requires no proof. My silence is not retreat. I can exist without argument. Competition does not belong to me. I am safe in my own center. 10. Respect is not a strategy, it is an inner grounding. Being respectable is not the result of learned tactics. It does not come solely from memorizing the right sentences, staying silent at the right time, or giving the correct reactions. Because strategy changes according to circumstances. But respect settles into one's character. All the points we explored in this series. Not entering narcissistic games, not carrying guilt, not giving into manipulation, naming passive-aggressive behavior, stepping out of the rescuer role, not submitting to silent punishment, rejecting power struggles, all point to one single place. Not abandoning your inner ground. A respectable person does not constantly shift positions based on what is happening outside. They are not someone who explains one day, defends the next, diminishes themselves another day, and reacts angrily the day after. They have an inner coordinate. And people feel this coordinate. Most psychological games are designed to move you from your place. They want to make you feel guilty. They want you to explain yourself. They pull you into defense. They rush you. They try to discipline you with silence. But none of these games find a response in a person who remains grounded. A respectable person now knows this. They do not have to be good in every relationship. They do not have to be agreeable in every environment. They do not have to be strong enough to carry every emotion. This awareness does not create hardness. On the contrary, it brings a deep softness. Because a person no longer has to attack in order to protect themselves. Do you know what manipulative and narcissistic people dislike the most? Not indifference. Clarity. Clarity does not shout. Clarity does not threaten. Clarity does not explain. Clarity simply exists. That is why a respectable person does not say things they will later regret. They do not draw boundaries they will later wish they had drawn differently. Because their decisions come not from fear, but from inner grounding. From a spiritual perspective, this state tells us this. When the soul is centered, it is not defenseless. When the soul is centered, it is not aggressive either. Therefore, respect is not earned. Respect is not demanded. Respect is not performed. Respect is a state of being. And people recognize it, quietly, over time, without argument. When a respectable person leaves the room, people do not think, they were so right. They feel, this person was centered. And that feeling is the most lasting one. Intentions. I set the intention to remain in my inner place. I set the intention to live through wholeness, not strategy. I set the intention to exist through clarity, not reaction. I set the intention to protect myself without closing my heart. I set the intention to carry who I am. Affirmations. Respect lives within me as I am. I can exist without abandoning my place. Clarity gives me safety. I am aligned with myself. My quiet nobility is enough for me. Being respectable is not about speaking loudly, nor is it about finding the perfect sentence. Being respectable is about being able to stand in the world without losing yourself. And you, if you have come this far, you are already learning how to stand in that place. Today, on this journey where we chose to protect ourselves, we renewed our trust in our inner balance. Together, we explored ways to turn our hopes into a manifesto. Remember, life is whispering to you. When you dare to listen to your heart, paths begin to open. Until our next meeting, stay with light in your heart. I am Thelina, a fellow traveler walking under the same sky, toward the same dream, alongside you.